Hey, this is Scott Hambrick, scotthambrick.com. And earlier today I did an Instagram live and talked briefly about the worries that technocrats are giving me right now. People like Gates acting as a self-appointed World Health Authority and other technocrats taking a role in political decisions and personal health decisions and stepping outside their arena of expertise if they ever even had one. And I'm really surprised at how much leeway that these people are being given publicly. When I was a kid and we took U.S. history, I'm going to drink a Bloody Mary here while I talk to you guys. I took U.S. history. There was a lot of talk in there about in the late Industrial Revolution in the United States, we had robber barons, monopolists like John Pierpont Morgan or Andrew Carnegie, who ran U.S. Steel, or Rockefeller, who ran maybe the Standard Oil Trust, and how they were monopolists and they took unfair advantage of the markets and bought up their competitors and forced the ones they could not buy out and then drove prices up, and how the progressives, among like Teddy Roosevelt and so on, went trust busting and broke up the big monopolists, and how they were fat cats and how they were predatory capitalists and how monopolies should not be tolerated. And then even as recent in the 80s, I remember when Ma Bell was broken up into the Baby Bells, and the big telecom monopoly in the United States was broken forever. When that I remember going to stores when I was a kid, and you had to buy sanctioned equipment to hook to the telephone network. It was against the law to hook your own. You could own equipment, but you had to have bought it from the telephone company. But you couldn't just buy any sort of equipment you wanted, or even make your own equipment and hook it to the phone lines. And when they broke up Ma Bell into the Baby Bells, in Tulsa here it was Southwestern Bell, well, then we could start hooking other things up to that twisted pair that Southwestern Bell brought into our house. And pretty soon you had fax lines, teletype machines, and later modems. And off we went. Well, now we've got some monopolies, guys, but nobody seems to care. We don't hear talk about fat cats or trusts or monopolies or any of those old buzzwords from the beginning of the 20th century when the big trusts were broken up. Really interesting to me that that's not happening. It should happen. And I've spent a little time researching some of these charitable foundations that have existed since the early 1900s and the influence those things have had on politics and foreign policy. Those big trusts, those extraordinarily wealthy tycoons and magnates, and we've got all these rhetorical words we use to name these guys, ended up creating big nonprofit foundations that ultimately carried on all sorts of interesting activities on their behalf in perpetuity almost. So I've done a little bit of research here. I've just been copying and pasting some sections from Carroll Quigley's book, Tragedy and Hope. Carroll Quigley makes one of the, if not the best study of the activities of nonprofit foundations that you'll ever find. I'm just going to start reading some of this to you guys. I've just cut and pasted snippets of this book here into this document, and I'm just going to read it. I'll make a little commentary, but you can go check it out. It's Tragedy and Hope by Carroll Quigley. It's a hell of a read. I'm just going to start right here. Wait a minute. This book was put out by the Macmillan Company in the late 60s. Wasn't very long after they put it out, Macmillan somehow destroyed the plates. And that first edition contains some materials that are not in subsequent editions. And if I'm not mistaken, this chunk here on page 57, somebody may email me and correct this, but if I'm not mistaken, this chunk here on page 57 is one of the things that was cut out of the second and subsequent editions. Go look it up. Carroll Quigley, Tragedy and Hope, page 57. The financial activities of international bankers. In concentrating, as we must, on the financial or economic activities of international bankers, we must not only totally ignore their other attributes. They were, especially in later generations, cosmopolitan rather than nationalistic. They were usually highly civilized, cultured gentlemen, patrons of education and of the arts, so that today colleges, professorships, opera companies, symphonies, libraries, and museum collections still reflect their munificence. For these purposes, they set a pattern of endowed foundations which still surround us today. The key international banking families. The names of some of these banking families are familiar to all of us and should be more so. They include Rering, Lazard, Erlanger, Warburg. Warburg Pincus is still around today, guys. Schroeder, Seligman Trust, you may have heard of that one. The Spires, Mirabaud, Mallet, Fold, and above all, Rothschild and Morgan. Even after these banking families became fully involved in domestic industry by the emergence of financial capitalism, they remained different from ordinary bankers in distinctive ways. 1. They were cosmopolitan and international. 2. They were close to governments and were particularly concerned with questions of government debts, including foreign government debts, even in areas which seemed at first glance poor risks, like Egypt, Persia, Ottoman Turkey, Imperial China, and Latin America. 3. Their interests were almost exclusively in bonds and very rarely in goods, since they admired liquidity and regarded commitments in commodities or even real estate as the first step towards bankruptcy. Does that sound familiar, guys? I'm going to read that again. They regarded commitments in commodities or even real estate as the first step towards bankruptcy. 4. Back to the text. They were accordingly fanatical devotees of deflation. And then he goes on in the book to describe that as devotees of deflation, they were in favor of the gold standard. And gold is necessarily deflationary because less and less of it is available to be found during mining. And when it is found, it's found at greater and greater cost. And gold is being consumed by industrial processes and loss and other things. So gold's deflationary, and those early banking families said so. But I'm going to tie this back in here. Stay with me. We're going to tie this back in here to my gripe about these technocrats. Page 775. On 775, he talks about how the tax code drives creation of foundations, which then act as perpetually politically subversive persons forever. Here in the United States, corporations, incorporated entities, are treated as persons, but yet they don't die. So you're supposed to sunset a corporation. They have a defined life in the Articles of Incorporation, I believe, but you can reincorporate them and keep rolling those assets over. So they essentially they essentially don't die. So back to the book here, page 775 of Tragedy and Hope. The chief of these he talks about government actions that these banking families had supported. He says the chief of these were in taxation law, beginning with the graduated income tax in 1913, but culminating above all else in the inheritance tax. These tax laws drove the great private fortunes dominated by Wall Street into tax-exempt foundations, which became a major link in the establishment between Wall Street, the Ivy League, and the federal government. Dean Rusk, Secretary of State after 1961, formerly president of the Rockefeller Foundation and Rhodes Scholar at Oxford 1931 to 33, is as much a member of this nexus as Alger Hiss, the Dulles brothers, Jerome Green, James T. Shotwell, John W. Davis, Eli Root, and Philip Jessup. Now, the tax code then leads to the creation of a bunch of these foundations that you guys have heard of. The Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Charitable Trust. You've heard some of these names. The Carnegie Foundation. Some of these are more politically active than others, but they continue to have an effect on American society long past the death of their founders. Here's an example, later on page 775. The New Republic. The best example of this alliance of Wall Street and left-wing publication was the New Republic, a magazine founded by Willard Straight using Payne Whitney money in 1914. Straight, who had been assistant to Sir Robert Hart, the director of the Chinese Imperial Customs Service and the head of the European imperialist penetration of China, had remained in the Far East from 1901 to there's a typo there, to earlier in the 20th century, and he became a Morgan partner and the firm's chief expert on the Far East. He married Dorothy Payne Whitney, whose names indicate the family alliance of two of America's greatest fortunes. She was the daughter of William C. Whitney, the New York utility millionaire, and the sister and co-heiress of Oliver Payne of the Standard Oil Trust. One of her brothers married Gertrude Vanderbilt, while the other, Payne Whitney, married the daughter of Secretary of State John Hay, who enunciated the American policy of the open door in China. In the next generation, three first cousins, John Hay Whitney, Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitney, and Michael Whitney Straight, were allied in numerous public policy enterprises of a propagandist nature, and all three served in various roles in the late New Deal and Truman administrations. In these, they were closely allied with other Wall Street liberals, such as Nelson Rockefeller. Very interesting to me. And these people come out of this tradition of international banking. And early in the 1900s and before, according to Carroll Quigley, these international banking fraternity operates as secret private firms. So from Quigley, one of their less obvious characteristics was that they remained as private, unincorporated firms, usually partnerships until relatively recently, offering no shares, no reports, and usually no advertising to the public. This risky status, which deprived them of limited liability, was retained in most cases until modern inheritance taxes made it essential to surround such family wealth with the immortality of corporate status for tax avoidance purposes. The persistence of the private firms continued because it ensured the maximum of anonymity and secrecy to the persons of tremendous public power who dreaded public knowledge of their activities as an evil almost as great as inflation. As a consequence, ordinary people had no way of knowing the wealth or areas of operation of such firms, and often were somewhat hazy as to their membership. Thus, people of considerable political knowledge might not associate the names Walter Burns, Clinton Dawkins, Edward Grenfell, Willard Straight, Thomas Lamont, Dwight Morrow, Nelson Perkins, Russell Leffingwell, Eli Root, John Davis, John Foster Dulles, S. Parker Gilbert with the name Morgan. Yet all these and many others were part of the system of influence which centered on the J.P. Morgan office at 3 Wall Street. This firm, like others of the international banking fraternity, constantly operated through corporations and governments, yet remained itself an obscure private partnership until the international financial capitalism was passing from its deathbed to the grave. J. Pierpont Morgan and Company, originally founded in London as George Peabody and Company in 1838, was not incorporated until March 21st of 1940 and went out of existence as a separate entity on April 24th of 59 when it merged with its most important commercial bank subsidiary, the Guaranty Trust Company. The London affiliate, Morgan Grenfell, was incorporated in and still exists. So, they've put their wealth in their individual wealth in these trusts that are creating politically active publications like the New Republic. Meanwhile, their main business operations are private. They are acting, they're unincorporated. They're not required to do public filings like so many other companies are. And that way they're able to hide the membership of those groups. And you end up with a veil of secrecy behind the people who make the decisions in these foundations that's very difficult to penetrate. So I'm going to go back to page 90. I'm sorry this is a little disjointed, guys. I just went through my notes from when I read this book a couple of years ago, and just cut some chunks out of here because I wanted to share it because a number of people on Instagram had asked me to do so. So if it's too disjointed, tough. Page 90. So we've established already that these banking firms operate in secrecy and privacy, and that they've moved that the individuals who operate those have moved a lot of their private assets into foundations which are acting, which have begun to act in politically motivated ways and are influencing governments. Page 90, the birth of the progressive movement. During the same period, there appeared a new movement for economic and political reform known as progressivism. The progressive movement resulted from a combination of forces, some new and some old. Its foundation rested on the remains of agrarian and labor discontent which had struggled so vainly before 1897. There was also, as a kind of afterthought on the part of the successful business leaders, a weakening of acquisitive selfishness and a revival of the older sense of social obligation and idealism. To some extent, this feeling was mixed with a realization that the position and privileges of the very wealthy could be preserved better with superficial concessions and increased opportunity for the discontented to blow off some steam than from any policy of blind obstructionism on the part of the rich. As an example of the more idealistic impulse, we might mention the creation of the various Carnegie foundations to work for universal peace or to extend scholarly work in science and social studies. As an example of the more practical point of view, we might mention the founding of the New Republic, a liberal weekly paper by an agent of Morgan financed with Whitney money in 1914. Somewhat similar to this last point, was the growth of a new liberal press, which found it profitable to print the writings of muckrakers and thus expose to the public eye the seamy side of big business and of human nature itself. But the great opportunity for the progressive forces arose from a split within big business between the older forces of financial capitalism led by Morgan and the newer forces of monopoly capitalism organized around the Rockefeller bloc. As a consequence, the Republican Party was split between the followers of Teddy Roosevelt, and those of William Howard Taft, so the combined forces of the liberal East and the agrarian West were able to capture the presidency under Woodrow Wilson in 1912. Guys, go back and listen to that again if you need to. But we're going to talk some more here in a minute that will expose this a little bit more. But these foundations are purposefully moving a little bit left to let the public blow off steam to ease the discontent of the public. And in doing so, they've created things like the Carnegie Foundations, which mostly seem to be helpful and innocuous at worst, maybe. I don't know. But they've also created controlled opposition in the liberal press, which they found to be profitable, from his own words here, to print the writings of muckrakers and expose to the public eye the seamy side of big business. Now remember, guys, big business is funding this. This is what this is telling us. So when these progressive forces created this split in big business between the Morgan bloc and the Rockefeller bloc, they were able to get Wilson in 1912 by kind of splitting the votes there. And, of course, Wilson, screw that guy. Later, on page 770, we talk about how these foundations are continued to be used into the 40s now. I'm skipping quite a bit ahead in this book, of course, where it talks about how these foundations are being used as extra-governmental agencies. They're acting as, in some ways, as de facto government agencies without all the government oversight that would be necessary for a legit government agency. Again, page 770. The fact was that this plan was a government-sponsored project. Well, I'll just finish this. It sounds like I'm starting in the middle, but it'll become clear. The fact was this plan was a government-sponsored project to fly about 24 American scientists to Russia. This is 1946. In an Army plane, and Condon's participation was canceled by the Army because it regarded him as too valuable a nuclear physicist to be risked behind the Iron Curtain where he might be kidnapped. The HUAC report, that's the House of Un-American Activities, right? That's the communism, the big Red Scare committee, I believe. Report said that Condon recruited members to join an organization listed as subversive by the Attorney General, the American Soviet Science Society. It later developed that this organization, which existed for the purpose of translating scientific reports from Russia to English, was using funds from the Rockefeller Foundation, had never been listed as subversive by the Attorney General, but on the contrary, had been encouraged by the United States government as a method of finding out what the Russians were doing in science. The HUAC had simply confused the society with an entirely different organization, which the Attorney General had listed. Now, this American Soviet Science Society was originally selected for Condon to recruit members from, or to recruit members to join, because they believed it was subversive. That was their error. But in this book here, you can see that the Rockefeller Foundation was funding this society, and was being used and was being encouraged by the United States government as a method of finding out what the Russians were doing in science. So they're using this. The House Un-American Activities Committee found that the government was using this Rockefeller Foundation organ. I don't know, is it espionage? It's certainly intelligence work. Moving on, in the 1938 to 48, a new magazine was created to support the United Nations. The role of Mike Straight in the situation in 1938 to 48. Remember Mike Straight? He was a Morgan board member, if I remember correctly. The role of Mike Straight in the situation in 1938 to 48 is clear. He took charge of his family fief, abolished the editorial board, and carried on his father's aims in close cooperation with labor and left-wing groups in American politics. In these efforts, he was in close contact with his inherited Wall Street connections, especially his Whitney cousins and certainly family agents like Bruce Bliven, Milton C. Rose, and Richard J. Walsh. They handled a variety of enterprises, including publications, corporations, and foundations, which operated out of the law office of Baldwin, Todd, and Lefferts of 120 Broadway, New York City. In this nexus were the New Republic. These are the names of the magazines and so on. The New Republic, Asia, Theater Arts, the Museum of Modern Art, and others, all supported by a handful of foundations, including the William C. Whitney Foundation, the Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney Foundation, the J.H. Whitney Foundation, and others. An interesting addition was made to these enterprises in 1947 when Straight founded a new magazine, the United Nations World, to be devoted to the support of the UN. Its owners of record were the New Republic itself, under its corporate name, Nelson Rockefeller, J.H. Whitney, Max Ascoli, who was an anti-fascist Italian who had married American wealth and used it to support a magazine of his own, The Reporter, and Beatrice S. Dolivet, the last lady, Mike Straight's sister, made her husband, Louis Dolivet, international editor of the new magazine. The new magazine is the United Nations World. So these people with their Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Morgan, Whitney foundation and therefore business interest connections are very interested in supporting the United Nations and pushing the United Nations. We read on. An important element in this nexus was Asia Magazine, which had been established by Morgan's associates as the Journal of American Asiatic Society in 1898. They have been creating these propaganda outlets by 1948, it had already been 50 years. It had been closely associated with Willard Straight during his lifetime and was owned outright by him from January 1917. In the 1930s, it was operated for the Whitneys by Richard J. Walsh and his wife, known to the world as Pearl Buck. Walsh, who acted as an editor of Asia, was also president of the holding corporation of the New Republic for several years and president of the John Day Publishing Company. In 1942, after Nelson Rockefeller and Jock Whitney joined the government to take charge of American propaganda in Latin America in the office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, Asia Magazine changed its name to Asia and the Americas. In 1947, when Mike Straight began to drive to sell the United Nations, it was completely reorganized into United Nations World. It's just the facts, guys. I don't know if any of you guys that are listening are finding this as alarming as I do. I've read it before, but I'm still alarmed by it. These people that are essentially bankers by genetics are using accrued wealth from almost a century of business operations that has been sheltered from taxes in charitable foundations that cannot die. Using the income from those charitable foundations are using this wealth and influence and, frankly, the support of the government to create entirely new propaganda organs in order to change maybe presidential elections. We've already seen that when this example of the Woodrow Wilson election earlier. And in this case, politics in Latin America and ultimately the formation and the adoption of the United Nations. I'll keep going. I'm not mad enough yet. Page 780. Communist Research Group publishes plans in the New Republic. During the winter of 1947 and 48, Lou Frank recognized that he was incapable of handling the complex issue raised in Wallace's many speeches. Wallace was running against Truman for president. Accordingly, he joined a communist research group which met in the Manhattan home of the wealthy Wall Street Red Frederick Vanderbilt Field. The chief members of this group, probably all communists, were Victor Perlo and David Ramsey. This pair drew up for Wallace an attack on the Marshall Plan and an alternative communist plan for European reconstruction, which was published in the New Republic on January 12, 1948, and presented by Wallace to the Marshall Plan hearings of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. God. What? I gotta do some research here as we go. So the New Republic prints a communist plan for Europe construction contra the Marshall Plan, and of course the New Republic. You can go read yourself here. In fact, we can go over here a little bit farther. Well, we'll just do it because. Rather than explain, I'll just keep going. Page 781, J.P. Morgan felt that all political parties were to be used. The association between Wall Street and the left, of which Mike Straight is a fair example, are really survivals of the associations between the Morgan Bank and the left. To Morgan, all political parties were simply organizations to be used, and the firm always was careful to keep a foot in all camps. Morgan himself, Dwight Morrow, and other partners were aligned with Republicans. Russell L. Leffingwell was aligned with the committee on February 24th, but was subsequently repudiated by Straight. In the 3 months following the Perlo article, I jumped ahead there. In the 3 months following the Perlow article, Strait was busy sawing off the limb on which Wallace now sat with the communists. He discharged from the New Republic payroll all those who were working for the campaign rather than for the magazine. And that's a sneaky line, isn't it? They had people on the New Republic payroll that were working for the campaign but not the magazine. And the office on East 49th Street once again settled down to publishing a liberal weekly. In protest of this reversal, his managing editor, Ed Johnson, resigned. If Mike Strait planned to do what he did to the communists in 46 and 48, that is, to get them out of the progressive movement and unions, he pulled off the most skillful political coup in 20th century politics. It is not clear that he did plan it or intend it, but as a very able and informed man, he must have had some motivation when he began in 1947 the effort which he knew might defeat Truman in 48. While the evidence is not conclusive, there are hints that another, more personal motive might have been involved, at least partly, in building up the Wallace threat to Truman's political future. It concerns the Whitney family interest in overseas airlines. Then it goes on to talk about Pan America. Sorry about that little piece there, but J.P. Morgan felt that all the parties were to be used, and he had agents in both parties, and he actively manipulated both parties, and they were both either an organ of his bidding or a controlled op. And they flipped as to which ones they were. And in this example here about Mike Strait and the article by Perlow and Lou Frank, they used the New Republic, as best as I can tell, to align the Wallace campaign with communists and ultimately torpedo Wallace. The Whitney family had interest in, I believe it was Pan Am Airlines, and they believed that a non-Marshall Plan realignment of Europe would hurt their airline routes and their airline business. You can go and read there. 788. We'll just go a little bit longer, and then I'll go to bed. Front organizations established in key countries. At the end of the War of 1914, this book jumps back and forth a little bit, it became clear that the organization of this system had been greatly extended. Once again, the task was entrusted to Lionel Curtis, who established in England, in each dominion, a front organization to the existing local roundtable group. So, I'm not going to give an example. You'll hear. This front organization, called the Royal Institute of International Affairs, had its nucleus in each area of the existing submerged roundtable group. In New York, it was known as the Council on Foreign Relations and was a front for J.P. Morgan and Company in association with the very small American Roundtable Group. The American organizers were dominated by the large number of Morgan experts, including Lamont and Beer, who had gone to the Paris Peace Conference and became close friends with the similar group of English experts, which had been recruited by the Milner Group. In fact, the original plans for the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the Council on Foreign Relations were drawn up at Paris. The Council of the RIIA, which, by Curtis's energy, came to be housed in Chatham House across St. James Square from the Astors, was soon known by the name of this headquarters. And the board of the Council on Foreign Relations have carried ever since the marks of their origin. Until 1960, the council at Chatham House was dominated by the dwindling group of Milner associates, while the paid staff members were largely the agents of Lionel Curtis. The roundtable for years, until 1961, was edited from the back door of Chatham House grounds in Ormond Yard, and its telephone came through the Chatham House switchboard. Council on Foreign Relations in New York is dominated by J.P. Morgan. The New York branch was dominated by the associates of the Morgan Bank. For example, in 1928, the Council on Foreign Relations had John W. Davis as president, Paul Cravath as vice president, and counsel on 13 others, which included Owen D. Young, Russell Leffingwell, Norman Davis, Allen Dulles, George W. Wickersham, Frank L. Polk, Whitney Shepherdson, Isaiah Bowman, Stephen P. Dugan, and Otto Kahn. Throughout its history, the council has been associated with the American roundtablers such as Walter Lippmann, Shepherdson, and Jerome Green. The academic figures have been those linked to Morgan, such as James T. Shotwell, Charles Seymour, Joseph Chamberlain, Philip Jessup, Isaiah Bowman, and more recently, Philip Mosley, Grayson L. Kirk, and Henry Wriston. The Wall Street contacts with these were created originally from Morgan's influence in handling large academic endowments. In the case of the largest of these endowments, that at Harvard, the influence was usually exercised indirectly through State Street, Boston, which, for much of the 20th century, came through the Boston banker Thomas Nelson Perkins. So the Council on Foreign Relations, you can go look that stuff up and see how influential that the Council on Foreign Relations has been. And this right here draws a direct line between Morgan, the academic figures at the Council of Foreign Relations, and Morgan's influence on State Street in Boston, and thereby at Harvard. We go on just a little bit more. Closely allied with this Morgan influence were a small group of Wall Street law firms whose chief figures were Larry Root, John Davis, Paul Cravath, Russell Leffingwell, the Dulles brothers, and more recently Arthur Dean, Philip Reed, and John McCloy. Other non-legal agents of Morgan included men like Owen Young and Norman Davis. I for a time, worked with a gentleman on buying a business here in Tulsa, and he was represented by the Cravath law firm, and he said, who's your counsel? And I told him who my attorney was. And I said, well, please give me the contact information for your counsel. And it was Cravath Law Firm, New York City. Well, I didn't know what the heck that meant. And my attorney said, yeah, let's pass on this deal. And we did. J.P. Morgan and Company were the center of the Round Table Group in America. On this basis, which was originally financial and goes back to George Peabody, there grew up in the 20th century a power structure between London and New York, which penetrated deeply into university life, the press, and practice of foreign policy. In England, the center was the Round Table Group, while in the United States it was J.P. Morgan and Company or its local branches in Boston, Philadelphia, and Cleveland. Some rather incidental examples of the operations of this structure are very revealing, just because they are incidental. For example, it set up in Princeton a reasonable copy of the Round Table Group's chief Oxford headquarters, All Souls College. This copy, called the Institute for Advanced Study, and best known perhaps as the Refuge of Einstein, Oppenheimer, John Neumann, and George F. Kennan, was organized by Abraham Flexner of the Carnegie Foundation and Rockefeller's General Education Board after he experienced the delights of All Souls while serving at Rhodes Memorial Lecture at Oxford. The plans were largely drawn by Tom Jones, one of the Round Table's most active intriguers and foundation administrators. The American branch exerted its influence through 5 American newspapers. The American branch of this English establishment exerted much of its influence through 5 American newspapers: the New York Times, the New York Herald Tribune, the Christian Science Monitor, the Washington Post, and the lamented Boston Evening Transcript. In fact, the editor of the Christian Science Monitor was the chief American correspondent of the Round Table. And Lord Lothian, the original editor of the Round Table and later secretary of the Rhodes Trust, and ambassador to Washington, was a frequent writer in the Monitor. It might be mentioned that the existence of this Wall Street Anglo-American axis is quite obvious once it is pointed out. It is reflected in the fact that such Wall Street luminaries as John W. Davis, Lewis Douglas, Chuck Whitney, and Douglas Dillon were appointed to be American ambassadors to London. And to wrap this little chunk up here, the chief aims of this elaborate semi-secret organization were to coordinate the international activities and outlooks of all the English-speaking world into one, which would largely, it is true, be that of the London Group, to work to help backward colonial undeveloped areas to advance towards stability, law, and order, and to prosperity along lines somewhat similar to those taught at Oxford and the University of London, especially the School of Economics and the Schools of African and Oriental Studies. This would include the ideals of democratic socialism, finance capitalism, monopoly capitalism, secularism, internationalism, etc. Well, that's a little bit disjointed, but that gives you a taste of what is at stake with these people and what they were all up to. You can get that in Tragedy and Hope by Carroll Quigley. And there's a lot out there about the Council on Foreign Relations and the Cecil B. Rhodes Foundation and its aims. But we've seen this before. We've seen this before. And that's what I'm telling you. Very, very wealthy individuals, in this case, people from the world of finance, created foundations. The foundations then have become politically active, in some cases, not just manipulators of the government, but actually the cat's paw of the government or an organ of the government, and have created a number of organs used to influence public opinion. Many of the sources they cite in support of their own activities are sources that they own and control. And most of this is hidden in plain sight. And it's still happening today. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, with all of the money they have, plus the money that they are getting from Buffett and others, is acting in a very, very similar way. I believe that they have ceded the sort of overt political realm of like foreign policy and economic policy to the old school foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation, the Council on Foreign Relations, and all of that stuff, and have taken up some new technocratic realms of action like public health, technology access, and some of these areas of interest that the Rockefeller Foundation, one, maybe isn't that interested in, or two, isn't equipped to deal with. But, you know, we're just taught to think, oh, they're such kind, benevolent oligarchs, and they're very generous with their foundation funds, and they're giving us vaccines, so we should love that. Or they built us a library, so they're just fine, aren't they? Maybe not. Yeah, don't believe anything I read. Go check out your own stuff. Go have a look. Meanwhile, you guys wash your hands, take care of yourselves, and try to have a good time, all right?